Hello, everyone, and welcome to What Fresh Hell Laughing in the Face of Motherhood. This is Margaret.
And this is Amy. And this week we're going to talk about picky eaters.
We have talked about picky eaters on the podcast before.
Yes.
But we realized that that was our first ever episode of the podcast.
Episode 1. Yes. Picky
It's
eaters.
something that people ask us a lot about, and it's totally worth a revisit. I did ask Margaret at some point giving an update on my picky eaters. And so that's also in the feed. But this, Amy, I'm going to blow your mind because we talk about our own kids and their eating habits in this episode. How old was your oldest kid when this episode
in this time capsule? I mean, it's from 2016, so 8 years ago. My oldest was 13.
13 years old. You blew my mind. You're like, well,
Wow.
my 13-year-old. I'm like, holy cow, it's been a long road, Ms. Wilson.
Wow. And that was
We've
the
been
big
walking these lonely streets all these years.
Yeah, that 13-year-old now drives, can go to a bar if he wants to. Yeah.
Well, I want to say that during that episode, I'm going to read you a direct quote from that episode. Thought maybe I would have had my notes open. Amy, I'm going to read you a direct quote from that episode.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Yes.
I wish so much that I could look into the future and know that this all works out okay. Like if I could look 10 years down the road into the future and know it's okay, I wouldn't have to worry so much about it.
Who said that, you or me?
Me. And I was like beating myself up in this episode. I'm like, and I will say, I certainly have some of my own issues around food, which I've discussed on the podcast. I consider myself in some ways to be a picky eater, which I find to be one of my worst qualities. And it's something that I've definitely, in my family, I guess I'm a more difficult eater. I have a lot of issues around this episode, and I was listening to baby Margaret, and I just wanted to be like, sweetheart, relax. So if you are baby Margaret right now, I am literally, wow, is that the wrong use of the word literally? I am figuratively reaching through the microphone and putting my arms around you to give you a gigantic calming hug and say, it's not all going to be all right. It's not going to work out perfectly. But like everything else, it's going to be different. I have told a story on the podcast before.
Yeah.
About a friend of mine from college who gave me life-changing advice, which is that she had snuck somewhere away that she was not supposed to be in high school, I believe with a boy, gone to some house, maybe her grandma's house, probably to, I'm sure sit and say prayers while they held hands on the couch. And she had locked the keys to the car in the car. And so she's where she's not supposed to be. She's made this huge mistake. She sits down on the sidewalk and she said that the thing that she kept saying is this is going to be different at some point. I am not always going to be sitting here dreading this moment. And I kept coming back to me, listening to this episode and thinking, wow, it really did turn out just like that. I will say that food and what my kids eat at the time we recorded that episode, I would say was occupying roughly 79% of my bandwidth.
Yeah.
And I would estimate that today it occupies about 4% of my bandwidth.
That's good.
And that's the best thing I can say to people.
Can you set the table for what was happening in 2016 in this episode? You had a picky eater. How picky? Why was it taking up 79% of your bandwidth?
I can and I will. My children, let me knock your socks off for a minute, were 7, 5, and 4.
Okay.
So mealtimes were hellacious. They were what fresh hell every night for some
what reheated
reason.
Hell?
What
Microwaved
reheated, or even worse, what hellacious thing have I put maximum effort towards to be greeted by literal shouts of dismay?
That's
tears,
a good use of the word literal. That was literal shouts of dismay.
Yes.
and literal tears.
Literal tears. And it is an area where I put so much pressure on myself, and the results were mixed. I think there were things we talked about that really helped me. One of my kids, I have realized, has some sensory stuff that defines a lot of aspects of things for this child. I talked a lot about picky eating and like, oh, it was part of a larger constellation of things that are going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't really see those things as clearly then as I do now. And food was a problem for real reasons. And that's fine. It's totally fine. And I think also my kids do not eat a rainbow. But the other day, this is my big win, which like to some people I'm sure will seem insane. We got takeout Chipotle, and I was like sitting around watching 3 of my kids just eat like Chipotle. If you had told me that picture would exist 9 years ago, I would have been like, that's insane. Like, one of my kids only eats very plain pasta. One of my kids would never even be able to smell Chipotle,
Yes.
no less be in the same room with
Yes.
it. Things have evolved so much. And do my kids now, are they like, Mother, might you pass the Brussels sprouts? For indeed, they are my favorite. No. Kids who were very good eaters then have different issues now. Different things go on with food throughout your life. And I'm going to spoil the ending. I think the best thing that we did around food was make it the least interesting thing happening at the table. Family, conversation, and joy was the purpose of Mealtime. We can dig in a lot on what that looks like and what that means. But looking back, if I could have reached back through the microphone and told baby Margaret one thing, I would have said, you're doing the most important thing, which is filling your household with a generalized feeling of like caretaking and happiness and
positivity around mealtime instead of fear and apprehension and fighting.
And writ large, I think your kids will remember these eras as like, we did a lot of singing and dancing and driving and going to the zoo and seeing cool stuff and having a lot of fun and laughs. And they're not going to remember Mealtime that much. And I think I probably could have done things better in terms of always offering maybe wider ranges and stuff. But I think what actually happens is that your kids turn out to be the kind of eater that you are.
Mm-hmm.
And like, spoiler alert, this is the podcast. I talk about having reread my journals at one point from like 4-year span, and I was in a relationship, and every other page was just me saying the exact same thing about the relationship again and again for 4 years straight. And like, how I didn't realize that I was writing the same thing every 2 days. But like, the podcast version of that is your kids are going to turn out like you.
So this first episode, I didn't re-listen, but I remember at the time, so my oldest kid was the picky eater in the family.
Correct.
And I assume, because I think this is what happened in real life, by the time my oldest was about 13, he was moving out of that stage. And I remember you being like, what's the secret, right? And
oh my gosh, I literally was like, tell me your ways, Amy. I need to know what you did.
And everything, and this was a kid who, just to set the table for where this kid had been, was just, again, like a sensitive kid in other ways too, which I think you're right to underline that. Like, didn't like tags on clothes, pants had to be soft, that kind of stuff. And that kid would eat like 4 foods and then 5 foods and then penne but not rigatoni and this kind of roll but not that kind of roll and there were many years of that. And then slowly with, I think, I'll skip to the ending. For me, I think the key is you don't worry about it, but you don't ignore it, right? Like not freaking out about it doesn't mean never put any thought into it. It's like you help them, you encourage them, you put different foods in front of them. There are things you can do to keep it from getting worse, certainly. But worrying about it is not really one of them. And in this kid's case, as they reached puberty, started going into, growing quickly, and then went to a camp without us for a couple of weeks where dinner was dinner. And that was, I wouldn't recommend it for everybody, but for this kid, that did the trick nicely. Like, oh, I do like enchiladas. And again, like enchiladas, that was not in my wildest dreams that I think this kid would ever eat enchiladas. Well, they did when that's all there was at this camp. And there were peers and there were cool 20-year-olds saying the enchiladas were delicious, like all sorts of things I couldn't provide at home.
And what I think, looking back and re-listening to the episode, really jumped out at me is that one always makes choices in one's home about what their preferences are, and then the variables are different children that come into those choices. And what I'm saying is this. I certainly have kids who have a lot of anxiety around food. I remember being that kid. I remember having those anxieties. I then make a choice that I choose peace over anxiety at mealtime, which may mean you don't have to try the food that grandma just made. And if you don't like it, I'm going to allow you to try the plain option of that item, even if it means that at my table, someone says, I can't believe your kids don't eat what they're served. Like,
oh, that's it, right. That's the
I
problem.
can make
Your
my
shame,
own choices
right.
about how we conduct ourselves around food, even if other people don't agree with those choices. And I think that when I listen to baby Margaret, I just hear so much of like, I want to do the right thing and I want everyone else to do the right thing.
And everybody else to tell me that I'm doing the right thing.
My kids changed a lot in 8-9 years, but also Margaret changed a lot in 8-9 years of like, oh, we've actually made a choice to alleviate anxiety on this score that you may or may not agree with. And listen, may or may not be the right choice, but that's what we're doing. And what I'm seeing in the big picture is kids who have enough nutrition, probably could use to eat a little bit more vegetables. I could have used to eat more vegetables as a kid. I really like vegetables now. I eat a lot of them. I order them at every meal. Like, it's fine. I have chosen where on the spectrum of anxiety to new foods I want to live, and I just personally feel much more comfortable with it as a choice also.
I have a thought about anxiety around food and this whole issue, which clearly underlies it. Can we take a break and then I'll tell you what I think it is?
Let's do it.
So I think I have a slightly different take, but it's probably coming to the same place, which is that anxiety around food is not worth it. And certainly at your table is not worth it. And fighting is not worth it. And all of that. On the other hand, what we know about anxiety is you can't reduce or address anxiety by accommodating it, right? That if it's like, I only
agree with that too.
I only eat blueberries. Like, okay, you only eat blueberries, but if you have a 6-year-old only eats blueberries and you only ever serve or present or make available blueberries, then you will have a 7-year-old who only eats blueberries. You
Correct.
have to, and then they'll be like, but I don't like that kind of blueberries, right? This one looks wrinkled or whatever. And the other thing I was going to say about anxiety is I think nobody who has anxiety about anything, food or airplanes or dogs or whatever, actually wants to have that anxiety. It's not a good feeling.
Right.
You don't want to have it. And I'm not saying that you're doing this, therapy in your home at every meal. That's not what you should do. But saying like, we're just not going to deal because it's hard is probably not. You're probably not going to move them along a way that they do want to move along. I'm thinking about my picky eater. We would go to a cookout, 4th of July, and I remember the tears in the car.
You talk about this on the other episode with his bun and tomato and ketchup.
Right. He needed a plan. Right. What am I going to eat? And I had decided that we weren't going to bring peanut butter and jelly sandwiches everywhere we went anymore because he would eat rolls, bread and rolls. Like that category was safe. And I had compassion, like this kid in his booster seat, teary, concerned, what am I going to have for dinner? I'm like, well, I know there's going to be rolls and you like ketchup, so you can have ketchup on rolls and then we'll see if there's something else you like. For me, I felt like that was I was accommodating, I was not accommodating his anxiety. I was compassionate towards his anxiety. I let him know that he was going to be safe there was something he could do, but it wasn't like, you can sit in the car and I'll take you for ice cream later because you didn't like anything at the cookout. I just feel like there's this balance you constantly have to do with this, to not let it take over further. And it's hard to know where to draw that.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think that just having the conversation around, like, what am I solving for here? Am I solving for keeping people happy? Like, there's clearly too far an end of that spectrum, right? Like, you don't want to just be like, the most important thing is that my kid never face an obstacle, and therefore it's buttered noodles forever. That's not healthy. On the other hand, I want to go to this wedding, and I know that one of my kids is going to cry the entire time there about the food. And I actually kind of want to enjoy my, let's say, sister's wedding. And so I am going to take food off the table tonight.
Different. Yeah, I agree.
And we're going to work at it some other day. It's maybe a not today problem. Similarly, and I still do this with my kids. We just had this recently. I had a family dinner, lots of generations at the table. I said to my kids beforehand, and my kids are teenagers, like, find something you want to eat on the table. I don't really care what it is.
Right.
Try not to comment on the food. I'll keep some a little plainer on the side in case you don't like the sauce on it. Eat that. It's totally fine with me, because for me, what I'm solving for, like, what's most important at that table is, like, my kids getting the gift of sitting down with, like, 3 generations at a table. Not like, are you trying the food? I don't care if you're trying the food.
But even getting that 3 generations at a table, that's tricky sometimes. Like, with a really, really picky eater, restricted eater, getting them to sit down. Like you were saying before, like, if the smell of Chipotle makes you gag, and there are kids for whom this is not, like, they're not making that up. Even sitting at the table and coexisting with food is a big step. It's something that I think is important, but it's not easy.
Oh, I had this child. Yes, absolutely. A kid who, and there's lots of kids, like, it's obvious, like, every, comedy thing you see is like, oh, we can't let the food touch, and yikes, and that kind of thing that kids have. First of all, kids don't have a lot of things they can control. They can control what they put in their mouth. So, like, there's a reason why control and food goes together. It's very normal. It makes a lot of sense. There are some beloved, we love them, biological imperatives here, right? That kids' food tends to get more restrictive as they get into motion, because in the wild, you don't actually want a kid who can walk everywhere and put everything in their mouth. So, like, a baby puts everything in their mouth is different than a 3-year-old who does, because that 3-year-old is more likely to encounter poison berries, right? Lots of different reasons why these are all things that reasonably happen. Then it's meeting your kid where they are and then helping them to move where they are. Like, that's the 2-pronged thing that we're always trying to do. And yes, for lots of people, that's a kid who's like, can you tolerate sitting in a room with someone who's eating mustard? I'm not going to lie, Amy, I still struggle with that myself. Like, if I sit down at a ballpark and a guy next to me is eating, like, a hot dog with mustard and ketchup on it, I'm like, hey, this guy has ruined my day. I just don't.
It's the combo. Don't let him sit next to me. The combo of ketchup and mustard. Keep walking.
It's so gross to me, and, like, the smell of it. And I have a lot of my own sensitivities around food and smells. My husband calls me the super sniffer, and it's true. Like, I don't choose to be around smells I don't like. So, like, I think food can be a great place to use our former guest, Dr. Becky's good inside starting. That, like, this kid is good inside. They're trying to give you their best. But, like, if what you're getting is very difficult, like, why? Don't start with, like, it's because they're a bad kid. Like, no, they're a good kid. Now let's start the conversation. And I think that's right. They're a kid who wants to be at the table with all of us enjoying themselves. What's getting in their way of that? And then what are the decisions I'm willing to make in regard to that? And it's not as simple as, like, they'll eat when they're hungry and taste the rainbow. No. That being said, I think there are some big guidelines that we can talk about around mealtime that I think are helpful.
Okay.
One of them is in order to think about this question of like, what is going on at mealtime that is making this eating picky, right? I'm going to say one of the biggest culprits, I think, is dinner time. That dinner is the meal at which we most often focus on, like, this is when the family comes together. This is when we try these foods. This is the meal I cooked for 3 hours. This is dinner, headline. And that dinner can be one of the worst times of day to be eating because everyone's tired. Everyone's at the end of a long day.
After school restraint collapse has...
Everyone's had their after school restraint collapse.
is in full effect, right?
There's other stuff they're trying to get to. You know, as your kids get older, it's homework.
Yep.
As the kids are younger, it's often like, okay, after dinner is dessert, relax TV, you know, fun things. There's a lot working against you at dinner time, and it's worth just clocking that. And the biggest thing that is working against you is that your kids may not be that hungry.
Mm-hmm.
So especially young kids who've been at school all day, they've had usually like 3 meals by dinner time. They've come home, they've had a snack. How hungry are they? And so think of all of these factors that are coming together, and you're like, it's time to try my delicious mustard chicken. And it's like, no, I don't want to do that. I'm not hungry. It smells gross. I'm tired. And I just want to get to cartoons that I know come after dinner.
Right.
And so I just put that in your path, folks.
Mm-hmm.
Like, maybe lunch is the time to try more new things.
Oh, that's interesting. And also I was thinking lunches, sandwiches, and carrot sticks. But dinner, again, we like code these things, right? Lunch can be little bite-sized things. Bread with anything on it counts as lunch. But dinner has to be a meat with some kind of gravy on it and a vegetable. And it's also where we're more likely to innovate and try new and different things, because I don't want to eat the same thing every day, and my spouse doesn't. So we try to mix things up. And neophobia is one word they use to describe these kids for whom like a new food is deeply, deeply upsetting, unfamiliarity around food. And dinner is the time where that neophobia is most likely to rear its head. Don't you think? You have the same thing for breakfast every day. They can have the same thing for lunch every day. I don't care. But dinner, like you said,
breakfast
mustard
is
chicken.
basically 8 moving parts, right? Like pancakes, waffles, French toast. I mean,
cereal.
we're in the U.S.
Right.
Like bacon or sausage, and then like strawberries or oranges or apples. Like, that's right.
And picky eaters like breakfast because it's like it's the same. It's predictable. A lot of it is prepared foods, like pre-prepared foods, which are consistent. You know what a bowl of Cheerios is going to taste like. You even know what a blueberry is going to taste like, kind of.
People have different preferences at breakfast too, right? Like, you know, I am a toast and peanut butter.
Yeah,
that's my breakfast.
And every day, right? Which
every day,
totally
like,
let
I like
slide
my
for breakfast.
same little breakfast. I don't wake up looking for innovation. I like my bread and my peanut butter on it. That's what I like. And so it's not that these are rules that like kids are ready at breakfast, but you are waking up. It's the hungriest time of day. Like, there's reasons why, and I think that people have gotten the story of like, well, kids used to eat what they were served. It's like, but a lot of things have actually changed. I mean, kids maybe are not as active, or they're on different schedules. Like, there are reasons why maybe if you were like working on the farm all morning, you sat down to 1 meal a day and you just went to town on whatever it was. I don't know. But I think that starting with like, you clean your plate at dinner, there's a lot of things getting in your way there.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So if dinner's the place where you're most likely to introduce new foods, and also, so that's another reason, right? Your picky eater's going to have a hard time. I don't think that means necessarily that, okay, so you have the same 3 foods that are safe. I think I got into a little bit of a trap with my 2 kids when they were little, because my picky eater would only eat chicken nuggets and, microwaved frozen broccoli. And then I would eat something else with my spouse when he came home from work. And so I kind of turned into like, that's what's for dinner. And then all of a sudden when I was introducing something else, there was wailing and gnashing of teeth. If you want
Amy?
to, yes.
Same.
Yeah.
And that's how I grew up.
Yeah.
We had kids' dinner, and then my mom and dad ate when my dad came home from work, like a nice dinner.
And you want the
it
kids to eat.
definitely leads to some issues.
Yeah, you want the kids to eat, so you give them 2 or 3 things they eat, and then they'll eat 2 or 3 things. So what I'm thinking back to this first episode ever, I remember from this episode that you had used Pillsbury crescent rolls as the constant, that your picky eater, didn't know what awaited them on the dinner table. It might be mustard chicken, but there were also going to be Pillsbury crescent rolls. And there was this sort of sameness of one thing, and then you could introduce different things around it.
This was a solution that worked phenomenally for me. Familiar food with unfamiliar food.
Yeah.
That, like, you never go from, like, it's Pillsbury crescent rolls, chicken nuggets, and broccoli to mustard chicken, ramps and,
right.
Some sort of
Fishy
popover. Like, you don't do it. You can't make that hard left on a kid. And that's right. I think they call this chaining, food chaining, that, like, you start to introduce and build stuff out. And for us, that worked really, really well. That a kid who came to the table knowing whatever else happens, I could just eat a Pillsbury roll and I will not be hungry and miserable. And then I could just leave the table, or I could maybe try some of the other stuff. But, like, I'm looking for my familiar things. And I will say that I don't know if this was the greatest idea. My kids sometimes kind of approach this, like, but I do think there's a little bit of a skill in, like, you can find something to eat on that table and, like, put a small serving. I don't eat salmon. It's a very common food. People serve it everywhere. I don't like it.
I don't like it either.
You don't like salmon?
I hate it. Yeah, I'll say if I'm like out at like a dinner kind of thing and they serve salmon, I mean, it's somebody else's house, I'll just eat it. But if I'm at a restaurant or something, I'll be like, I'm sorry, I'm vegetarian, because I'll have any old mushy
anything
pasta
with salmon.
and salmon. Yeah.
So funny. I don't know if we've discussed that. Salmon is gross. So I know if I go to a dinner party, like if I came to your house for dinner, it's 2 couples, right? Like you're like, I've made my delicious salmon. My heart sinks and I'm like, hopefully you've called me beforehand and been like, is there anything I don't eat? And I'm like, salmon and peas are the 2 things we don't want on the table. But I haven't. So now it's time to eat the salmon. I take a small serving of salmon and then I load up on the sides. Like, that's still how I eat with stuff I don't like. So I think, and this leads me into my next big revelation. And we got some really solid solutions in part 3. We're going to be right back. So you were talking about my familiar foods. Very helpful. Big point. I'm not going to dial down on it because if you've listened to the podcast at all, you already know it. Big fan of the whiteboard where you lay out, especially for kids who are anxious, here's what's for dinner every night.
Yes.
And here's what's happening every night. Wednesday, Dad leaves town. Friday, Dad is back. Mom goes out to dinner with, like, for kids, as soon as they can read, you can do this with pictures when they're littler. I think it's super helpful to give kids a lot of information.
Sarah Olsher did this. Remember Mighty and Bright is her company? We had her as a guest of Fresh Take.
Yes.
And she was talking about this in terms of kids, if it's divorced parents and they're going back and forth from home to home. The most important thing for a kid is to be able to see a visual representation of here's how today's going to go. So it totally makes sense that happens for food too.
And think about it. Like, being a kid is really hard. I mean, my sister-in-law, I remember, pointed this out to me at some point. Like, school is like, okay, it's art time. Are you enjoying art? Stop art. It's math time. You hate math, but you have to do it for an hour. Okay, now stop it. Now kickball. And you're like, what the heck? Like, if someone made you live your life like that every day, it would be torture.
Right.
And I think, like, that we forget that, like, oh, come on, we're going. Jump in the car. Where are we going? Like, a kid is just constantly at the mercy of your whims and then shows up to dinner and it's like, I don't know what this weird food is and I don't know if I want to eat it.
Right.
Well, that's what's for dinner. And that's not, if my spouse and I are home alone, what do you feel like? What are you in the mood for? So first thing I started doing that really helped is a lot of, like, and it sounds like a lot of work, and please know that I'm not talking about like Pinterest board versions of this. A lot of, like, make your own, add your own. So it's a burger night. There's like cheese, bacon. There's like 4 things that could go on the burger. And then it's taco night. And so it's like, you can just have plain ground beef with rice, or you can have rice and beans, or you can have you can make your own version. And I do think that giving kids some control over the choices they make is helpful. And one thing that unlocked this for me, and it never occurred to me, is letting kids serve themselves at the table too. That like I had gotten very used to like, here's your segmented plate, and I give you this much of this and this much of this and this much of this. Once we started passing food, I feel like the kids just had a lot more control.
That's
like
interesting. Yep.
I can take a little bit of salmon and a lot of roll and 3 pieces of broccoli. Like that's my comfort level with this food. And that I found until my kids were 8 or 9, again, like you said, like just out of habit, just out of shortcut, I was like, okay, I know you don't like this, so I'll give you a little piece. I was making all of those decisions and it was getting in the way of their like growth in relationship with food.
I love that make your own idea, because then these kids again for whom new foods are a little distressing, they can see the chickpeas on the table and immediately be like, chickpeas. And you say, I think they're delicious. I especially like them when I cook them in the oven and they're crunchy. You're exposing them to them in a they're not on their plate, but they're in the room and they see somebody else enjoying them. And then maybe 2 weeks later, they see you enjoying them again. Like it's a good way to introduce more foods into their awareness in a low pressure way.
Yeah. And I do think that the action of like, I'm going to reach over and try that versus like,
yes,
there will be no brownie until you eat it, is just a completely different kind of interaction. And something I think that kids can start doing very, very early. And then, table culture, we talked a lot about in this episode. And the only thing I want to say about table culture is we don't talk about the food at my dinner table.
I love this.
My sister-in-law gave me this rule. Talk about anything but the food. You like it, you don't like it, you eat it, you don't eat it. Think about hunger. Like maybe a kid's not eating because they're not hungry. Now that my kids are teenagers, we're doing another reset around, oh, wait, I'm not hungry at dinner, and then I'm going to eat 36 Oreos and make 47 trips to the fridge to eat nonsense.
That's not allowed. That's not a good idea.
Turns out, no, it's not great. Because I still get a lot of like, well, I'm not hungry at dinner, but suddenly at 9, I'm eating a bowl of something, and it's you have to let kids make their own choices to a certain degree, but parameters around it make sense.
And what about dessert? Do you offer dessert regularly in your house?
I will say my kids are now at an age that they get their own desserts.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just having this conversation this week with my husband. We're just a little bit, we need a back to one at our house. We're out of control with a lot of things. It's like I've been sick and traveling, and he's been traveling, and like just like the piles of chaos are everywhere, and the like, let's just get taken because we're lazy is every night, and the let's stop at the corner store for dessert on the way home from the sport, the concert, the lesson has become this weird default also.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's time for a back to one around like just kind of dessert as food,
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things I looked up revisiting this episode is don't make dessert a default. And I was like, oh, that's a smart idea.
Right.
Like dessert happens sometimes. Sometimes there's cookies on the table when you get home from school.
Right,
but
right. It's
there's
neutral.
no like giant balance wheel in which like if this, then this, food and dessert.
It's not a reward. It's not a
reward.
A naughty, I deserve this. It's just, right. It's just sometimes it's there and sometimes it isn't.
Yeah. Sometimes it's there and sometimes it isn't. And sometimes we eat too much of it. And, one of my kids once, I was thinking about people talking about, I was reading some article about, they went to grandma's and she fed them this and now we're all fighting because we don't allow it. And I'm kind of team, like, there's never one day that makes your nutritional profile. So, like, I don't care what they eat at grandma's house. But at one point, my kid went to grandma's house and ate so much ice cream. And they don't have any kind of lactose intolerance, but they ended up with like really bad gastrointestinal problems that were painful, I would say. I won't go into details. Maybe some people are eating while they listen to this. But it kind of taught them not to do that. I mean, I think that this can all be a little bit more light touch. The other thing I did did we talk about New Food Wednesday already?
No, but I mean, we have ever, but you should talk about it now.
The other thing that I tended to do, and I did love this and it worked out really well. Someone gave me this tip. I stole it from someone. Can't remember who. Wish I could credit you. New Food Wednesdays. So that we tried new foods on Wednesdays and then the rest of the week. And then once it was a New Food Wednesday, it could go into any slot on the rest of the week.
New Food Wednesday becomes regular Tuesday.
New Food Wednesday became regular Tuesday.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things that you talked about that I think is very important is watching the labeling and, like you said, the falling into.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, he doesn't like peas. I'm never going to serve him peas.
Right.
Oh, well, he wouldn't want that. Oh, he won't taste that.
Mm-hmm.
Always offer. Just
Mm-hmm.
continually offer. And I do find now that my kids are tweens and teens that they constantly surprise me with, you know what I want to try? I mean, my kid who I didn't work that hard on pretty much eats everything, just went on a trip with his aunt, was eating all sorts of crazy foods that I would have never thought of. And I try not to comment on that either. Like, oh my God, you would have never tried that before.
Right.
Just kind of try to let the food stuff be a stream that's passing.
Mm-hmm.
Every once in a while, you may have to go into the stream and do a rescue. That rescue being like, you have eaten 76 Oreos and nothing else, so we need to do a reset around this. But generally, just let it pass you by.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The other hopeful story I will tell, Amy, is that in this episode, our New Food Wednesday that I had just done was lasagna, and it went terribly. But I was like, it's only one day a week, and it's kind of the point of the thing. Everybody tried it. Nobody will eat it now. It's horrible. They thought I was trying to kill them, making them eat lasagna. And I will say that my pickiest kid, is now basically Garfield. Like, he only eats lasagna. And I was like, be careful what you wish for, people.
That's such a good.
I went from a non-lasagna eater to Garfield.
And that's an intense, that's an intense process. But for food chaining, lasagna, like, once your kid will eat noodles with stuff in it, like I was thinking about, food chaining is like, if your kid eats cheese ravioli, then maybe now they'll eat cheese and meat ravioli, and now they're eating ground beef, and now you can you chain from familiar things become. Or if your kid will eat crescent rolls, maybe they'll have peanut butter on crescent rolls, and now they're going to try almond butter. Okay, now we have almond butter. Now we can try this. The lasagna
and
is
also,
very
like, a tortilla wrapped around chicken. Is a chicken sandwich, is a bao bun in a Chinese restaurant.
Right.
You can really be like, this is what this is. And it's the same thing we say about so many things. You're scaffolding rather than getting in there and making something.
Mm-hmm.
You're just like, oh, let's try it. Oh, I'll serve a variety of things. Oh, this, oh, that. Not like, if I do not somehow get this pork chop into this 6-year-old's mouth, it means everything is lost.
Right.
Not true, friends. From the future, we're here to tell you, not true. And I will say, before we close, it's not perfect at my house. Kids who were the most sensory are still struggling the most with this. As you get older, different issues start to come in around food, especially, weight and food issues. There's lots of stuff down the road that's still going to be complicated and difficult. Set that tone of, like, what happens at my table is joyful family time, and the food is secondary to it. The food will come along, but keep your pediatrician about this too, because there's a condition called AFRID, which I won't go into.
ARFID.
You can Google it. Say it again.
It's ARFID, not AFRID.
ARFID. I thought it was AFRID. It's ARFID. Google it. Like, that's different than picky eating.
Right.
And so don't look to us for things that are medical issues. Like, is your kid gaining weight? Are they getting enough nutrition? These are questions you should be talking about every year at your pediatrician's office. And then from your comedy podcast friends, you should be getting the idea that, like,
New Food Wednesday.
We think you can relax a little bit and maybe try New Food Wednesday.
Well, the relaxing, right. Your anxiety will not change anything. It might increase the anxiety of your picky eater, who probably feels anxious around food, and that's why they're picky. They're not doing it to get to you, even though it feels that way.
Yes, for sure. For sure. They're good inside. They're hungry inside. Just just find it together.
Yeah. Solved it.
Solved it for the second time, maybe. Let's be honest.
Yes, for the second time. Right. Then and now, picky eaters, they aren't a problem anymore.
We are going to link out to the episodes we talked about.
Do you follow us on YouTube? If you go to youtube.com and search What Fresh Hell Podcast, or just click the link in the show notes for this episode, you can follow us on YouTube. We're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. Go subscribe to us there. Even if you don't have to watch every video or anything, just hit subscribe, get us to 1,000 subscribers so now you're out there.
Video.
We have a bunch of our episodes on video. You can watch us talking. You can see shorts. You can see some of our comedy shorts. You can see all sorts of stuff we do. So follow us on YouTube.
So much fun to be had over on YouTube, friends. And with that, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
So long.